The Americas remain an area of heightened risk. The situation is constantly changing and remains complex there. Until the 1970s, the main source of rabies was domestic animals. Later, they were replaced by wild coyotes, foxes, skunks, and raccoons. Bats are also very dangerous. It is worth noting that they are only vectors. These animals do not like the taste of the virus, so they do not get rabies. Since the 1990s, raccoons have become more common carriers. Latin America suffers not only from sick dogs, but also from bats. The so-called vampires are particularly prominent. They infect not only domestic and wild animals of other species, but also humans. There are several types of rabies, and vampire bats can give you the nastiest, paralyzing form. There is also a tendency for vampire bats to become the main reservoirs of infection. The African continent suffers from rabies in dogs, but hyenas and jackals also play their part. Outbreaks of rabies in wild animals are becoming more frequent. The WHO is already sounding the alarm that it is time to get the situation under control. Otherwise, the risk of a full-blown pandemic is high. People in Asian countries have had the most trouble with the virus. Dogs are the most common carriers. 40,000 deaths from rabies have been recorded, particularly in India. Around 700,000 people are treated for bites from domestic and wild animals. Not just dogs, by the way. Monkeys, cats, camels, pigs, and horses can also be affected. That is why prevention has been carried out on a large scale in places where it is possible to provide modern medical care to victims. Outbreaks of rabies have not yet been recorded in New Zealand and Australia, but the disease is becoming increasingly common in the bat population. This could lead to major health problems in the future. Did you know that the first step in the fight against rabies was taken by the French microbiologist and chemist Louis Pasteur? It was he who created the first effective vaccine against the disease, which until recently was a death sentence for anyone, regardless of age, wealth, or state of health. He started his first work in 1880. The impetus for his feverish work came from the agony of a patient. The girl was only 5 years old. She had been bitten by a dog infected with the virus. The child could not be saved, but Pasteur devoted himself to finding a vaccine against rabies. He was devastated by the child's death and didn't want it to continue. In the 19th century, there was much more known about rabies than when it was first described. The first written source about this infection dates back to the 1st century BC. It was written by the Roman Cornelius Celsus. 2 millennia have passed, and we have not completely defeated this insidious disease. Many of its mechanisms remain one of the mysteries of the 7 seals for doctors. Pasteur never discovered that the pathogen was a filterable virus. This discovery was made by another French scientist in 1903. The French doctor Paul Remlinger discovered the true cause of so much death and suffering. Pasteur did not have this life-saving information, but it was not in his nature to give up. He took a different approach. He searched for sources of infection and tried to find a way to kill the infection and save the carrier, while at the same time making an effective antidote. He eventually realized that something in the body of an infected animal is transferred to a bitten or otherwise injured person and causes a fatal infection. This happens most often when saliva enters the wound. The result is damage to the nervous system and death. It was Pasteur's research that confirmed that rabies had a long incubation period. This became an encouraging fact. There is always the possibility that before the active phase of infection has begun, methods can be found to influence a slowly developing pathology and eliminate the danger of a fatal outcome once the toxin reaches the spinal cord and then the brain. We needed the sources of infection, so the scientists deliberately infected the rabbits. He had to get the deadly toxin as needed to make a vaccine. Dozens of times he patiently transferred diseased brain tissue and allowed the infection to enter a healthy rabbit. The experiment was then repeated again and again. He managed to get the rabbit to die within a week of receiving a concentrated extract, rather than over a period of 16 to 21 days. It was a huge victory for medicine at the time. The next step was to weaken the infectious agent so that it did not kill, but instead created a stable immunity to rabies in the body, thereby killing the cause of its appearance. It was Pasteur who invented the modern method of making vaccines by weakening any pathogen. A way was found, but not immediately. Drying rabbit brain tissue for 14 days over alkali, which effectively absorbs moisture, helped. When the resulting suspension was given to a dog with rabies, it not only recovered, but also developed a strong immunity to the disease. In other words, it became completely immune to this type of infection. The amount of contaminated material introduced into the recovered organism had no catastrophic effect on it. There was no reinfection. After enough time had passed to be convinced of a positive result, Pasteur's followers and the scientist himself continued to search for a cure. It turned out that the laboratory's 7-day poison did not work on those animals that had been vaccinated and did not die. To understand why, a cruel experiment was carried out. The vaccinated dogs were allowed to attack rabid animals of the same species. All the mongrels bitten remained perfectly healthy. Now it was time to test it on humans. But where could one find people willing to sacrifice their future on the altar of science? In desperation, Pasteur even considered experimenting on himself. But luck came to the rescue of medicine and the researcher. On the 6th of July, 1885, a tearful woman came to him. She was holding the hand of her own son. The boy was only 9 years old. Joseph Meester had been bitten by a rabid dog 3 days earlier. The dog had inflicted 14 wounds on him. The unfortunate woman had already mentally said goodbye to her own child. In her opinion, the rescue was not worth waiting for. Death in such situations was almost always 100% guaranteed. The boy's father heard of the famous doctor's research and work and insisted that he be brought from Alsace to Paris. Pasteur's hesitation was understandable because he was dealing with a child, and the scientist's preparation was experimental. It had not been tested on humans, and the risk was too great. Otherwise, the little patient was guaranteed to die in terrible agony. So, at his own risk, the doctor administered the vaccine to the young patient. Surprisingly, Joseph emerged victorious from this battle. Doctors Granchet and Villapot were present during the experiment. A young patient was vaccinated with half a dose of vaccine made from a rabbit brain extract. The animal died of rabies. The product was treated with dry air for 15 days. 13 injections were given, 1 per day with an increase in the volume of the drug. After 3 months, the boy was examined. He was not only alive, but healthy. Paris became a mecca for those in similar tragic situations. They literally traveled from all over the world in search of a miraculous salvation. Unfortunately, not everyone could be helped. More than once, Pasteur was accused of being a murderer. It was not in his power to help, heal, and keep alive all those who suffered. The vaccine did not help if more than 14 days had passed between the bite and infection. In 1887, a shameful meeting of the Academy of Medicine took place. At this meeting, colleagues directly accused Pasteur of being a madman who had killed many patients who had come to him to be cured with pieces of rabbit brain. On the 23rd of October, the scientist suffered a second stroke. He never recovered and died in 1895. Of course, all the accusations were false. The great doctor had done nothing to deserve such a terrible sentence. 40 injections in the abdomen could not help if the victim came to the doctor too late. Today, a memorial plaque proudly flaunts on the house where Pasteur's first research laboratory was located. It lists all the discoveries and achievements he made during his colorful and sometimes tragic life. He proved that fermentation is caused by enzymes. He disproved the hypothesis that microorganisms were spontaneously born. He was the first to develop the concept that immunity could be enhanced or artificially created. It was this scientist who developed vaccines against chicken cholera, rabies, and the previously fatal anthrax. Other little things were not mentioned. There was simply not enough space. ordinary people did not agree with the guilty verdict of Pasteur's colleagues. In 1.5 years, people from all over the world raised 2.5 million francs by subscription. The Pasteur Institute was created with these contributions. It was officially inaugurated on the 14th of November, 1888. To this day, the great doctor's tomb and a museum commemorating his life and work on behalf of humanity remain. World Rabies Day was established by the World Health Organization, WHO, to be observed every 28th of September. To be continued in the next episode. Stay tuned.